I want you to picture this really intense cinematic scene right now. We're going back to April 20th, 1997.
Right, upstate New York.
Yeah, exactly. Upstate New York. You have to understand, this isn't some peaceful march with like a few picket signs.
Oh, definitely not.
Angry protesters have completely paralyzed these major vital interstates. Like the highways are totally shut down, traffic is backed up for miles, and people are just trapped in their cars. Tires are literally burning on the asphalt.
It was absolute intentional gridlock, just a complete severing of the state's transportation arteries.
And it escalates so fast. It turns into this brutal physical clash between the protesters and law enforcement. Let me just hit you with the hard numbers from that single day.
Go for it.
11 people arrested, 12 police cruisers heavily damaged, like many of them with windows smashed and bodies dented, and 12 New York State troopers are sent to the hospital.
I mean, it reads like a scene from a civil war, honestly.
That is the perfect way to describe it. Because when you look at those numbers, hospitalized troopers burning highways, you instinctively think this has to be a major civil rights dispute, or maybe like a massive federal land grab.
A deep existential threat to an entire way of life, right?
Right. But it wasn't. The trigger for this literal localized war zone was about the right to tax a pack of cigarettes.
A single pack of smokes.
I remember reading this for the first time, and my brain just stopped working. Like, the esteemed troopers were hospitalized over tobacco tax.
It sounds absurd when you say it out loud.
It really does. But that is exactly why we are doing this deep dive today. Our mission for you listening is to decode this mind-bending economic war that this single riot sparked. Because we are looking at a decades-long geopolitical and economic war of attrition.
And it's between the United States federal government, state governments, and Native American tribes.
Yeah. And our foundational source for this deep dive is just an incredible piece of forensic research. It's a working paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, or the NBER.
Written by 3 top-tier economists. We have Philip DeCicca from McMaster University, Donald S. Kenkel from Cornell, and Feng Liu from the Shanghai University of Finance and Economics.
And I want to set expectations for you right now. Do not picture 3 boring academics sitting in a dusty room crunching spreadsheets.
Far from it. You really have to think of them as forensic decoders.
Yes. They essentially built a microscope to look at a multi-million-dollar black hole. They use these massive surgical data sets to uncover an economic reality on the ground that defies absolutely all standard business logic.
So, to understand how a tiny cigarette tax triggers a bloody conflict, we have to start with basically the accounting error of the century.
Right. Imagine an error so massive it burns a hole in a state's budget every single year, and the state just lets it happen. They literally stand there and watch the money evaporate.
It's the ultimate runaway chimney.
A runaway chimney,
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, and to understand why the state was paralyzed, we have to look at the legal status of Native American tribes in the U.S. It is a profoundly unique structural dynamic. Legally, tribes are classified as domestic dependent nations.
Which, I mean, that sounds like a total contradiction in terms. Domestic but dependent, but also a nation.
It is entirely a gray area, and that gray area is the battlefield. They exist within the physical borders of the United States, but they possess inherent sovereignty over their own members and their own territory.
Right.
They have their own governments, their own constitutions, their own law enforcement on their land. The state government doesn't just get to walk in and dictate terms.
Well, I understand the broad concept of tribal sovereignty, but how does that philosophical concept translate to a pack of Marlboros at a convenience store?
It translates through the tax code. Over the years, the Supreme Court has had to establish very specific, very sharp dividing lines regarding what states can and cannot do on sovereign tribal land. And the absolute brightest line is this. Individual states like New York do absolutely not have the authority to collect state excise taxes on cigarettes sold to tribal members on Indian reservations.
Well, that seems entirely fair. It's native land. They are a sovereign entity, so the state of New York shouldn't be taxing their internal commerce.
The Supreme Court agreed. Native Americans buying on native land are completely exempt, but here is the catch.
There's always a catch.
Always. The Supreme Court also ruled, and they specifically upheld this in a 1994 decision regarding New York, that the state does have the legal right to collect state cigarette taxes when those reservations sell cigarettes to non-members.
Ah. Okay, let me make sure I have this straight. If a native person buys a pack of cigarettes on the reservation, no state tax. But if I, like a non-native person, drive from Syracuse onto the reservation to buy cheap cigarettes, The state of New York is legally allowed to tax my purchase.
On paper, the law is crystal clear. The state has the right to tax your purchase.
But in reality,
Enforcing that law was a physical impossibility.
because of the border.
Precisely. You have state tax collectors trying to operate inside a domestic dependent nation that frankly does not want them there.
Which makes total sense.
Right. It created intense, volatile friction. Remember that 1997 riot we started with?
The burning tires.
Yeah, that was the direct result of New York's governor at the time, George Pataki, attempting to finally enforce that 1994 Supreme Court ruling. He tried to send the state in to collect the tax on non-native sales.
And the response from the tribes was to shut down the interstate and put state troopers in the hospital.
Exactly. The backlash was so immediate and so severe that barely a month later, the governor announced the state was entirely abandoning its efforts to collect the taxes. They officially backed down.
So the state just surrendered. I mean, they had the legal right granted by the highest court in the land.
Yeah.
But the actual physical cost of enforcement was just too high to stomach.
They surrendered for 14 straight years. From 1997 all the way to 2011, the state of New York effectively looked the other way. They allowed the reservations to sell to non-members without collecting a single dime of the state excise tax.
Whenever a government looks the other way, my first question is always like, how much money are we actually talking about? Because politicians don't usually walk away from a big payday unless it's genuinely terrifying to collect.
True.
I'm imagining a few people driving to a reservation on the weekend for a cheap carton of smokes. It can't be a staggering amount, right?
Let's look at the NBER paper's data on this because the numbers are frankly staggering.
Okay, hit me.
In 2004 alone, it is estimated that between 169 million and 219 million packs of tax-free cigarettes were sold on New York reservations to non-natives.
Wait, let me stop you. Up to 219 million packs in a single year.
Yes.
That is insane.
To put that scale into perspective, the total legal tax-paid sales for the entire state of New York that year were 648 million packs. So the reservation sales were roughly 1/4 to 1/3 as large as the entire legal tobacco market of the state.
That is no longer a loophole. That is a fully functioning parallel economy. What is the dollar amount on that? Like, how much tax revenue did New York just watch float away?
In 2004, that single loophole evaporated between $254 million and $329 million in state tax revenue. Gone. In 1 year.
Over $300 million. And the state just accepted it because sending the police caused riots. That is incredible.
It really is.
But hold on, if I'm playing devil's advocate for the tribes, couldn't they just argue in court that all those cigarettes were actually being smoked by Native Americans? Like, hey, we aren't selling to outsiders, or people just really like to smoke.
It's a great question, and the Supreme Court actually addressed that exact theoretical argument in their 1994 ruling.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, they looked at the sheer volume of tax-exempt cigarettes flowing into New York reservations. And the justices noted that if those cigarettes were actually being consumed exclusively by the tax-immune Native American population living there,
What's the math?
every single man, woman, and child on the reservation would have to be smoking at a rate 20 times higher than the average New York resident.
20 times. Every infant, every elder chain smoking 20 times the state average.
Exactly.
Okay. That is a brilliant, undeniable way for the court to slap down that argument. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that these cigarettes are hemorrhaging out to non-natives.
It was an undisputed, massive transfer of wealth. Hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue magically vanishing into this legal gray zone. Which brings us to the core suspense of this entire deep dive.
The big mystery.
Right. This is the central mystery the NBER economists wanted to solve. Who was actually pocketing that missing $300 million?
Okay, I love a good thought experiment. Let me try to deduce this using basically standard business logic. Let's set up the board.
Go for it. Put yourself in the shoes of a Native American tobacco retailer.
Okay.
You own a smoke shop on a reservation in New York. You are sitting safely behind a sovereign legal wall.
The cops aren't coming.
Right. The state tax collectors are too scared to come onto your land because of the 1997 riots. You can buy wholesale cigarettes completely tax-free. Your direct competitors, the gas stations and convenience stores just outside the reservation border, they have to charge an extra $1.73 per pack just to cover the state excise tax.
Okay, so I have a massive structural, legally protected advantage.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So knowing human nature and standard economic theory, How do you price your cigarettes? Who gets rich here?
Well, if I'm the smoke shop owner and I know the gas station 5 miles down the road has to sell a pack for, let's say, $6 because of that heavy state tax, I don't have to pay that tax. My cost is much lower.
Right.
But I am absolutely not going to sell my pack for $3. That would be terrible business.
Obviously.
I'm going to sell it for maybe $5. I'll undercut the off-reservation guy by just like $1 to convince people to make the drive to my shop. But I get to pocket the entire rest of that tax advantage, the extra 73 cents, as pure, unadulterated profit. I mean, I hold all the cards. I have the sovereign wall protecting me. My competitors can't legally match my price. I am keeping the lion's share of that money.
That is a perfectly rational deduction. That is what conventional wisdom dictates.
Right. It's just common sense.
And that is what essentially every politician, citizen, and standard economist assumed was happening. The prevailing narrative was that the tribes were using their sovereign immunity to hoard monopoly profits.
But I'm guessing our three forensic economists found a reality that violently slapped down that assumption.
They completely shattered it with counterintuitive data.
How do you even track that, though? There are no official tax records for these sales. The state isn't auditing these reservation smoke shops. It's a gray market operating in broad daylight.
This is where DeCicca, Kenkel, and Liu really show their brilliance as researchers. They realized that looking at macro-level market estimates or wholesale shipments was completely useless. The data was too noisy.
So what do?
They bypassed the sellers entirely and went straight to the consumers.
They tracked the people driving to the reservations.
Exactly. They utilized an incredible data set from the New York State Adult Tobacco Survey, the NYSATS. This wasn't some small sample. They looked at data spanning from late 2003 all the way through 2009. It was a massive telephone survey of New York residents.
So they just called thousands of people up and asked them about their smoking habits.
Yes. But they structured the questions brilliantly. They isolated a sample of 6,539 real current smokers.
Okay.
And they didn't ask vague questions like what you usually pay for cigarettes. They asked a highly specific, vital question. How much did you pay for the last pack of cigarettes you bought?
Oh, that is so smart. You bypass people guessing their monthly budget and rely on immediate, fresh memory. Like I bought a pack yesterday. I handed the cashier a $5 bill.
Exactly. And then they cross-reference that precise price point with another crucial question. Do you buy your cigarettes on Indian reservations all the time? Sometimes rarely or never.
And what did the survey reveal about consumer habits?
Out of those thousands of smokers spread across the entire state of New York, 19.3% claimed they always bought their cigarettes on reservations.
Almost 20%. 1 in 5 smokers in New York was bypassing the state tax system entirely.
Yep.
And these couldn't all be people living right next door to a reservation. Some of them had to be living dozens of miles away.
Right. Now here comes the ultimate counterintuitive punchline.
I'm ready.
The economists ran the numbers. They looked at the average New York state tax during the primary study period. As we discussed, it was $1.73 per pack. That's the money that should be going to the state.
Right, the $1.73 tax burden?
Then they looked at the exact amount of money those 19.3% of consumers saved when they drove onto the reservation compared to the people buying at normal off-reservation stores. What was the average price difference?
Give it to me.
Exactly $1.73.
Wait, down to the penny.
Down to the penny. The economists found what they call 100% tax shifting.
Hold on. Let me get my head around this. My whole business theory from 5 minutes ago was completely wrong.
Entirely.
The Native American retailers, sitting behind their impenetrable sovereign wall, holding the ultimate trump card, they kept none of the tax advantage for themselves.
Not a single cent. They handed every single penny of that $1.73 sovereign tax advantage directly to the outside consumer in the form of lower retail prices.
Why on earth would they give away all their profit? That makes zero business sense.
It really doesn't.
If I have a special advantage, I keep the margin. I don't give it all to the customer out of the goodness of my heart. Are they just running the worst businesses in the world?
It raises a fascinating question about market dynamics. To understand why the sellers effectively gave away the farm, we have to look past the sovereign wall separating the reservation from the state and look at the economic environment inside the reservation.
Okay, paint a picture for me. What does the retail landscape actually look like inside one of these reservations?
You have to discard the idea of one big, unified, tribal megastore setting prices for everyone. On most of these reservations, the environment was defined by brutal hyper-competition.
Really?
Yeah, the researchers looked at commercial retail databases and found that in the zip codes overlapping with Indian reservations, there were over 5 times as many tobacco stores per capita than the New York State average.
5 times as many. So they were just packed in there.
Wall to wall. On some reservations, there were dozens and dozens of independent smoke shops. Journalists who visited during this era described them as nothing more than one-room trailers dropped on a dirt lot with a single sales clerk working behind a Formica counter. The barrier to entry was incredibly low. Anyone who belonged to the tribe who had a trailer and could get some inventory could open a smoke shop.
Ah, I see exactly where this is going.
Because there were so many of them right next to each other, selling the exact same homogeneous product they engaged in, a cutthroat race to the bottom price war.
So if the trailer on the left tried to use my business strategy, keeping 50 cents of the tax break for themselves, the trailer on the right would just put up a bigger sign undercutting them right, keeping only 40 cents.
Exactly. And then the next trailer would undercut them to 30 cents just to steal the foot traffic.
Until the price is driven all the way down to the absolute floor, which is the exact amount of the tax break.
That's the reality. The intense hyperlocal competition forced them to pass 100% of the tax savings directly to the consumer just to survive. If they tried to keep a dime of it, the customer would just walk 10 feet to the next trailer.
That is a stunning, real-world example of perfect competition. The sovereign wall protected them from the state tax collectors, but it didn't protect them from each other.
Not at all.
So let's review the scoreboard here. The state of New York lost over $300 million. The Native American retailers fought tooth and nail just to make practically nothing in profit margins, and the only people who actually won were the non-native smokers getting dirt cheap cigarettes.
The consumers captured the entire multi-million-dollar tax dividend.
Wow. Okay, but I have to push back here because this data relies on a survey, right?
Yeah.
People self-reporting what they paid.
Yes.
Is it possible we are misinterpreting the cause and effect? Let's say I'm an incredibly thrifty person. I clip coupons, I drive out of my way to save 10 cents on gas, I negotiate everything. I am the kind of person who always buys on a reservation.
Okay, I follow.
Maybe the reservation isn't causing the cheap price. Maybe cheap, highly price-sensitive people just gravitate to the reservation and they'd find a way to pay $1.73 less no matter where they shopped.
That is an excellent, highly skeptical pushback. It's actually the exact statistical problem that keeps economists awake at night. How do you know you are measuring the effect of the reservation rather than the psychological profile of the buyer?
Right. Because human behavior is messy. How do you prove it's the location doing the work and not the coupon clipping mindset of the smoker?
To prove it, the economists needed a way to test their findings under extreme stress. They needed a shock to the system. And the state of New York inadvertently handed them the perfect weapon in July 2008.
What did the state do in 2008?
The state decided to try and choke out the black market by making the legal market even more painfully expensive. They enacted a massive, sudden tax hike.
Oh, boy.
They almost doubled the state cigarette tax overnight, jumping from $1.50 a pack up to $2.75 a pack.
That is a massive jolt to the system.
So think about what happens when the government suddenly doubles the tax. If the reservation sellers were holding any pricing power at all, if they had any leverage, surely they would use this chaos to pad their margins right. They wouldn't just automatically pass along an even bigger discount.
You would think so. A shock like that usually allows businesses to hide a little extra profit in the confusion.
Yeah.
Like everyone's raising prices, I'll just raise mine a bit too.
The data proves otherwise. When the state pushed the tax up by an extra $1.25, the reservation merchants simply slashed their relative prices even deeper.
You're kidding.
The survey data showed that the savings for a consumer buying on a reservation immediately ballooned to match it. The higher the state pushed the tax, the deeper the black market cut its prices to match the exact mathematical differential. It was a perfect symmetrical mirror.
That is wild. The state tries to squeeze them, and the hyper-competition just turns them into an even more efficient conduit for cheap tobacco. But honestly, that still doesn't totally solve my cheap people theory. Even with the tax hike, maybe the coupon clippers just negotiated harder. How did the economists definitively rule out this psychological factor of the buyers?
They used a brilliant econometric technique. We are going to avoid the heavy academic jargon, but the concept is known as an instrumental variable. I like to call it the God's finger experiment.
The God's finger experiment. Okay, explain how that works.
The economists needed a variable that acts like a random assignment, something that strongly affects whether you buy on a reservation but has absolutely nothing to do with your personal thriftiness, your negotiating skills, or your desire to save money.
Right. Something totally unrelated.
They found that pure, uncheatable variable in raw geography.
Geography. Like where the survey respondents physically live.
Exactly. They measured the exact distance in miles from every single survey respondent's home county to the zip code of the nearest Indian reservation.
Oh, that is so clever.
Because distance is an uncheatable variable. The physical locations of these Native American reservations aren't based on modern retail strategies or demographic targeting. They are the result of centuries-old treaties, historical displacements, and long-settled land borders.
Right.
And where a regular person chooses to live, their residential location is driven by jobs, school-quality housing prices, family ties, and crime rates. It is not driven by the desire to be geographically close to cheap cigarettes.
Right. Nobody is packing up and moving their family to Syracuse just so they could shave $1.50 off their daily pack of Marlboros.
Precisely. So distance is exogenous. It's a geographic fact determined by forces outside the consumer's control. The economists ran the model using geographic distance as the controlling factor, and the relationship was incredibly strong. The further away you lived, the less likely you were to drive to the reservation.
Okay, which makes total logical sense. So how does that solve the pricing mystery?
Because then they reran the pricing data using only this geographic distance as the filter. They stripped away all the self-reported habits, all the potential psychological quirks of the buyers, and looked purely at the geographic luck of the draw. And the savings model held up flawlessly.
Let me make sure I'm fully absorbing this. Even when you isolate the data purely to geography, stripping out human psychology entirely, the numbers still showed that 100% of the tax break was being handed to the consumer.
Yep.
The thriftiness of the buyer didn't matter at all. The only thing that mattered was the unyielding, suicidal competition among those trailer park smoke stalls.
You nailed it. It confirmed the 100% shift perfectly. The math was undeniable.
That is just it's a beautifully elegant piece of forensic data work. I love when numbers tell a story that clean and indisputable.
Well, hold on to that feeling, because just when you think you have a clean, universal rule of economics, the real world throws a massive wrench into the machine.
Oh, there's an exception to the perfect competition.
There is one glaring anomaly in the state of New York, a massive exception to the rule. We mentioned earlier that almost all the reservations, places like Tonawanda or Puspatek, had dozens of these little smoke stalls fighting to the death on price.
Right. The Formica counters racing to the bottom.
But the Onondaga Reservation in central New York is different. Very different.
What's their deal? What makes them the anomaly?
In the 1990s, the Onondaga tribal leadership made a radical decision. They looked at the chaos of the independent stalls on other reservations, the infighting, the race to the bottom, and they decided they weren't going to play that game.
Yep.
They forced all the private smoke shops on their land to close, and they replaced them with exactly one official tribal-run store.
Whoa. They created a monopoly.
A literal tribe-sanctioned monopoly within their sovereign borders.
Okay, I am so curious to see what the data shows here.
Yeah.
Because we just established that the intense competition is what forced the retailers to give away the $1.73. Without the cutthroat competition, what happens to that tax break on the Onondaga Reservation?
Remember your textbook business theory we discussed at the very beginning? The one that said a smart business behind a sovereign wall should keep the money for themselves?
Yes. My theory that got violently slapped down by the data.
Well, for the Onondaga tribe, your theory was absolutely correct. Because they had a monopoly, the survey data showed that consumers driving to the Onondaga Reservation only saved $1.04 per pack.
Wow. So instead of passing on the full $1.73 tax advantage, they only passed on $1.
Exactly. The tribe successfully swallowed the remaining 74 cents per pack for themselves. They captured roughly 30 to 40% of the state's tax break as pure tribal monopoly profit.
That is brilliant. But wait, how could they get away with only offering a $1 discount? If I'm a consumer and I know I can save $1.73 at the Tonawanda Reservation, but only $1.04 at Onondaga, wouldn't I just drive to Tonawanda? How do they keep their customers?
This is where geography becomes destiny once again. The Onondaga were geographically blessed. Their reservation is located at just 11 miles from Syracuse, which is a major population center in central New York.
Right.
Their nearest Native American competitor, the Oneida Reservation, is 33 miles away from Syracuse.
Ah. The light bulb just went on. They had a captive audience.
Exactly.
The consumers in Syracuse look at the map, realize they can save $1 by driving a quick 11 miles, or they can save $1.73 by driving 33 miles. The extra gas, the wear and tear on the car, and the extra hour of driving just aren't worth the extra 70 cents in savings.
It is a masterclass in geographic leverage and monopoly pricing power. They found the exact mathematical sweet spot. The discount was just big enough to attract the buyers out of Syracuse, but small enough that the tribe kept millions of dollars in excess margin that the other tribes were giving away.
That is fascinating. The contrast between Tonowanda's chaotic race to the bottom and Onondaga's highly calculated monopoly. It basically proves that the sovereign wall itself isn't what creates wealth. It's the market structure behind the wall that determines who gets rich.
That's the reality. But we need to look at the ultimate consequence of all this, whether it's a $1.73 discount or a $1.04 discount. The end result is that massive amounts of incredibly cheap cigarettes are flooding into the consumer market.
Right.
And this triggers a public health paradox that completely destroyed the state's intentions.
Okay, set this up for me. How does cheap tobacco break the public health model?
Let's do another thought experiment to understand consumer behavior. Let's say I give you a permanent, massive 50% discount on anything in a specific store.
Okay.
You walk in. Are you going to buy the premium, top-shelf luxury item, or are you going to buy the cheap, bottom-barrel knockoff?
If everything is deeply discounted, I am absolutely buying the premium item. Human nature says you upgrade when you have a massive discount. I'm going to treat myself to the good stuff.
Standard economic theory agrees with you entirely. There is a famous concept called the Alchian-Allen theorem.
Can we explain that without the academic jargon?
Definitely. Let's use the classic analogy. It's often called shipping the good apples out. Imagine a farmer grows two types of apples: cheap bruised apples and pristine luxury apples.
Right.
He wants to sell them in the city, but he has to pay a flat shipping fee, let's say $1 per apple, to put them on the truck.
Okay, a flat tax of $1 on every apple, regardless of quality.
Before the fee, the cheap apple costs $1 and the luxury apple costs $2. The luxury apple is twice as expensive, 100% more.
Tracking.
But now add that $1 flat fee to both of them. In the city market, the cheap apple now costs $2 and the luxury apple costs $3.
Oh, I see the math. Now, the luxury apple is only 50% more expensive than the cheap one instead of 100% more. The gap closed.
You've got it. The flat fee compresses the relative price difference. The luxury item becomes a relatively better deal. Because of this, people in the city end up buying a much higher proportion of the luxury apples than people living right next to the farm.
That makes total sense.
The flat tax naturally shifts consumer demand toward higher quality. This is a proven universal law of markets.
Okay, so applying this to our cigarette story.
Yeah.
New York State imposes a massive flat tax of $1.73 on every single pack, regardless of whether it's a premium name brand like Marlboro or some generic bottom-shelf brand.
Correct. The heavy flat tax makes the premium Marlboro relatively cheaper compared to the generic brand. So off the reservation in the fully taxed legal market, what do people buy?
Mostly the good stuff, right?
The survey data shows that 71% of smokers in New York buy premium name brands. Only about 15.3% buy cheap generic or knockoff brands. The Alchian-Allen theorem holds perfectly. The heavy flat tax pushes people to buy premium.
Okay, I see the trap. On the reservations, that flat tax disappears. They wipe out the $1.73 entirely. So the theorem should theoretically run in reverse.
It creates the backwards good apple. Removing the flat tax wildly amplifies the price advantage of low-quality junk. The cheap stuff suddenly becomes vastly exponentially cheaper than the premium stuff.
So human nature breaks down. You get a massive discount, and instead of upgrading, you downgrade.
Look at the face-slapping stats from the NBER paper. When the researchers looked at the survey data for the people who drove to the reservations, the people saving all that money, their purchases of premium brands plummeted by 13.7 percentage points.
They completely abandoned the good stuff.
And their purchases of low-quality generic garbage skyrocketed by 15.6 percentage points.
Let me make sure I'm fully grasping the absurdity of this. These consumers went out of their way. They drove miles out of town. They waited in line at a trailer park just to voluntarily downgrade to worse-tasting, lower-quality generic cigarettes.
Yes, because without the flat tax compressing the prices, The relative price of the cheap generics on the reservation dropped to roughly half the price of the premium brands. The mathematical incentive to buy junk was just too overwhelming.
Okay, as an economics nerd, that is a beautiful validation of a theory running in reverse. But practically speaking, that sounds like a public health disaster.
It is a profound public health catastrophe. Think about the entire stated purpose of imposing high cigarette taxes in the first place.
To get people to quit.
Right. The government raises the price to make smoking so painfully expensive that low-income, highly price-sensitive people are forced to quit. It is a behavioral tax meant to save their lives.
Right, you literally price them out of the habit for their own good.
But the reservation loophole acted as a gravitational black hole. By stripping away that flat tax, it didn't just save people a few bucks, it actively sucked the most vulnerable, price-sensitive populations out of the legal market and pushed them directly into smoking vastly cheaper, heavily unregulated, lower-quality tobacco.
Because suddenly they could afford to keep smoking, as long as they were willing to tolerate the really cheap stuff.
The tax that was meant to save their lives was actively pushing them toward worse outcomes, fueling a massive boom in the consumption of bottom-tier tobacco. It completely subverted the public health mandate of the state.
This is an absolute nightmare for New York State. Let's recap their position here. They are losing over $300 million a year in tax revenue. Their public health policy is actively backfiring and making people smoke worse cigarettes, and they know they can't send the police onto the reservations to stop it without starting a literal riot. They are completely cornered.
They were cornered for a long time, but governments rarely accept defeat forever. By 2011, the Cuomo administration, Andrew Cuomo, not his father Mario, who dealt with earlier phases of this, decided they had to stop the bleeding once and for all.
But how? If they remember the bloody riots of 1997, they know they cannot send tax collectors or state troopers onto sovereign native land.
They realized they couldn't fight on sovereign land, so how do you tax a place where you legally and physically cannot send your tax collectors?
I don't know. You embargo them.
You cut off their water supply from the outside. The state implemented a brilliant, bloodless strategy known as offshore enforcement.
Offshore enforcement.
Yeah.
Okay, explain the mechanics of that.
In June 2011, New York changed the rules of the game. They decided to target the supply chain. They forced all cigarette wholesalers, the massive corporate distributors operating strictly off the reservation, to pre-stamp and pre-tax all name-brand cigarettes before they were ever delivered to the Native American retailers.
So, that is a checkmate move.
It was incredibly smart.
If the reservation smoke shop wants to sell a pack of premium Marlboros, they have to buy it from a state-licensed wholesaler. But under these new rules, the wholesaler has already paid the $1.73 tax to the state and baked it into the wholesale price. The native retailer receives a pack that is already fully taxed. The sovereign wall doesn't matter anymore because the tax was collected miles away before the delivery truck ever crossed the reservation border.
The state of New York thought it had finally won the war. They bypassed the physical limitations of sovereign territory entirely and taxed the corporate supply chain. They thought they had choked out the black market forever.
Why do I sense another massive counterintuitive slap in the face coming?
Because the state vastly underestimated the resilience and ingenuity of the tribes.
What did the tribes do? They couldn't get cheap Marlboros anymore. The supply chain was compromised. Did they just fold and accept the taxes?
If they couldn't buy untaxed name brands from the outside, they decided they would just make their own from the inside.
You're kidding. They started manufacturing?
They industrialized. The tribes looked at the new laws and completely cut the New York wholesalers out of the equation. They realized their sovereign land exempted them from state manufacturing regulations.
Oh, wow.
So they started importing raw tobacco leaf directly. They built their own processing factories right on the reservations. They bought the heavy machinery. They rolled the cigarettes. They boxed them. And they sold them entirely within their own sovereign borders.
That is a jaw-dropping pivot, from running little one-room trailers with Formica counters to building full-blown industrial manufacturing plants.
At least 12 autonomous Native American tobacco brands exploded into existence almost overnight. The most famous and successful is the Seneca brand, produced by Grand River Enterprises. They created a completely closed-loop economy that the state of New York could not touch legally or physically.
The irony is just suffocating. By trying to aggressively choke out a bunch of trailer park smoke stins, the state of New York accidentally forced these impoverished tribes to evolve. The state's strict regulations forced them to industrialize, accidentally creating a multi-hundred-million-dollar modern manufacturing empire right inside their own state.
An empire that was completely beyond the reach of state tax law, pumping out millions of cheap cigarettes.
Okay, but let's pause and look at the human element here. Why fight this hard? Why go from protests and burning tires on the highway to hyper-competitive price wars where you make zero margin to building entire factories just for cheap cigarettes? Is it really just about a few tribal bosses hoarding cash?
The NBER economists address this exact point, and it reveals the ultimate human truth of this whole saga. It wasn't about a few people getting rich off monopoly money. If you look at the data from those highly competitive reservations like Tonawanda, the retailers were making razor-thin margins.
Right. We established they were giving the $1.73 right back to the customer, so they weren't getting wealthy.
They weren't fighting for luxury. They were fighting for sheer survival. You have to understand the economic baseline of these reservations. Historically, they have suffered from staggering poverty, massive endemic unemployment, complete isolation from the broader economic boom of the country.
They were desperate for any kind of economic engine.
And the cigarette industry, even with razor-thin margins on retail, provided that engine. It wasn't just the smoke shop owners making a living. It was the retail clerks working the counters. It was the truck drivers moving the inventory. It was the warehouse workers boxing the cartons. And eventually it was the factory workers operating the manufacturing machinery. It was an entire self-sustaining ecosystem of employment.
It was a vital economic lifeline for a population that had been systematically marginalized for centuries.
I want to deliver a quote from the source material that hits like a sledgehammer. It perfectly summarizes the stakes. It's from Ray Halberter, a prominent leader of the Oneida tribe. When he was asked about why the tribes moved into manufacturing their own cigarettes to bypass the state tax, he didn't talk about profit margins or the Alchian-Allen substitution effect.
What did he say?
He simply said, "We tried poverty for 200 years. Now we decided to try something different."
Man, we tried poverty for 200 years. Now we decided to try something different. That just completely reframes the entire NBER paper for me. It's no longer just a sterile study on tax incidence and price shifting. It is a deeply human story about a colonized people using the bizarre legal loopholes of their colonizers to claw back basic economic survival.
It ceases to be a story about tobacco. It becomes a story about the fundamental clash between sovereign survival and modern capitalism.
So let's step back and summarize this wild journey we've been on. This deep dive into the source material has taken us through some insane twists.
It really has. We've covered a lot of ground.
We started with a bloody highway riot in 1997, all because the state wanted a piece of the action. Then we zoomed in with a microdata tracking over 6,500 individual smokers, only to realize that the native retailers weren't hoarding the money. They were engaged in a suicidal price war that passed 100% of the tax savings directly to the consumers. Exactly $1.73.
A perfect transfer of wealth driven by intense hyper-local competition.
Except, of course, for the Onondaga tribe, who played the monopoly game perfectly, using their 11-mile proximity to Syracuse to swallow nearly half the tax break for themselves.
A masterclass in geographic leverage.
Then we watched the state's public health policy completely implode. The high taxes meant to save poor smokers just pushed them into the waiting arms of the backwards good apple theorem, making them voluntary consumers of bottom-tier generic junk.
A textbook example of unintended consequences.
And finally, New York tries to play 4D chess in 2011 by taxing the wholesalers offshore, only to watch the tribes industrialize overnight, building their own factories and creating a self-sustaining sovereign empire just to keep their people employed.
Which brings us to the macro view, the grand theory that ties all this together. This entire phenomenon is a perfect example of what we can call sovereign arbitrage.
Sovereign arbitrage. I like that term. Break it down for me.
Arbitrage is simply when you buy something cheap in one market and sell it for a profit in another. Sovereign arbitrage is when you exploit the friction between two different sets of laws. The gray areas created by borders, especially overlapping complicated borders like domestic dependent nations, create legal loopholes.
Right. The classic, you can't tax me here, but I can sell to people from over there.
Those loopholes create immense wealth. And here's the beautiful cyclical irony of it. The wealth generated by exploiting that border is then used by the marginalized group to reinforce and defend the very border that created the wealth in the first place.
Oh, wow.
They use the cigarette money to hire high-powered lawyers to build infrastructure to fund their own tribal governments, making their sovereignty even stronger and more resilient against the state.
The loophole funds the defense of the loophole. It's a never-ending loop of survival and defiance.
It is the ultimate jujitsu move against a massive bureaucracy.
Okay, I want to end on a provocative thought. Something that pushes beyond the data we just went through and looks to the future.
Let's hear it.
Think about what this story really proves. The state of New York, backed by the legal framework of the most powerful nation on earth, completely failed to enforce a simple tax law inside its own physical geographic borders. They had police, they had the Supreme Court, they had infrastructure, and they still lost to a legal loophole and a few determined tribes with trailers and eventually factories.
They were paralyzed by the friction of sovereignty.
Right, so if a powerful state couldn't control physical borders and physical highways, what happens tomorrow? We are entering an era of completely invisible borders. Cryptocurrency, digital nomads, decentralized autonomous organizations operating in the cloud.
The new sovereign frontiers.
Exactly. If the state couldn't police a guy driving a physical truck full of Seneca cigarettes from a reservation to Syracuse, how on earth are they going to police millions of people engaging in sovereign arbitrage across digital borders that exist purely in code? Are we going to see this exact same war, the offshore enforcement, the cat-and-mouse games, the complete inability to regulate a parallel economy play out all over again just without the booning tires on the highway?
Will the future of the decentralized internet look exactly like the 1997 cigarette wars of upstate New York?
That is a terrifying and entirely plausible thought to end on. I want to sincerely thank you for taking this deep dive into the source material with us. It's proof that sometimes the most boring-sounding economic papers are actually hiding the most intense cinematic stories of human survival. Keep questioning the consensus, keep looking for the loopholes, and we'll see you next time.